One of Namibia's most generous donor partners is that of PEPFAR, United States President's emergency plan for AIDS relief. PEPFAR, which was introduced during the George W.Bush administration in 2003, assisted third world countries in saving the lives of those suffering from HIV/AIDS around the world. In terms of this initiative, Namibia received close to $30 billion since 2005, making it the largest contribution by an external donor. Through PEPFAR in Namibia, 140,000 people were provided with antiretroviral treatment last year, while 11,000 pregnant women living with HIV received medication to reduce mother-to-child transmission. In addition, 15,000 men were circumcised to assist in the prevention of the HIV/AIDS spreading. However, the battle is still far from over. In the studio to talk to us about PEPFAR is the United States of America Ambassador to Namibia Thomas Daughton. In the studio to talk to us about PEPFAR is the Ambassador of the United States of America, Ambassador Thomas Daughton. Ambassador, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Joseph. It's good to be here.
PEPFAR has been in place for the last 13 years, and so far well over $1 billion was spent.
Right.
Yet AIDS continues to be the biggest health issue to face the country. Why is this the case?
There are actually several reasons, and I think there are things you need to keep in mind, kind of key points. The first one is that there's no cure. It's not like a sickness you take a drug for and it goes away. You also have to remember that 13 years ago, when PEPFAR started working with the Namibian government to address the HIV and AIDS problem here, more than 20% of the people in the country were infected. So that means 1 out of every 5 Namibians had the virus. And at the time, the ability to treat it was still pretty limited. So our initial response working with the government was an emergency response. That's why PEPFAR is the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief. And we have spent, well, we spent a good chunk of the last 13 years in emergency mode, just trying to identify the people who were infected and get them on life-saving treatment. Now we've reached the point where we've actually identified most of them. Not all of them, and not as many as we need to, but most of them. And they are on treatment. And as a result, Namibia, which is one of the countries that had one of the highest burdens in the world of HIV, has done as well or better than any other high-burden country. And so when we look at what we've accomplished here, working together with the government, we're actually pretty amazed at the progress that we've made.
And looking at the going rate, is Namibia likely to end the AIDS epidemic by the year 2020, as prescribed in the UN target 1990?
Well, that's a good question, and that is what we and the Ministry of Health and Social Services are working towards. It makes me a little nervous sometimes that people talk about ending the epidemic, because as I said before, there is no cure today for AIDS. There may be 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, but at the moment there's not. There is medication you can take to control the virus and live a perfectly normal, healthy life, but it doesn't actually make the virus go away. So for these 90-90-90 goals to be reached by the year 2020, that means that 90% of the people who are HIV positive have to know their status. And right now we're not there yet. We're close. We think about 166,000 Namibians know their status, but the estimate is that, the UN AIDS estimate is that about 237,000 are actually infected. So we've got to close that gap so that we get to 90%, and we're not there yet.
And how far are we to closing the gap, since it's only 3 years left now?
It is, but when you think about the rate at which both people are being identified and put on treatment and people are having their viral loads suppressed, as they say, which means bringing the virus under control, 350,000 people are being tested every year in a country of 2.3 million. Now, if the estimates are right, that means we've got this gap of roughly 56,000 people who don't know their status but are believed to be HIV positive. Of those, we need to get at least half to 2/3 of them identified. But if we're testing 350,000 people a year, and we've got 3 years to do it, I think there's a pretty good chance that we can accomplish it.
Last week at a press conference, you said that young people in particular, especially
men do not feel the need to get tested and know their HIV status, what is being planned to bring them on board?
Well, we're doing a lot of things right now because we've realized that we've reached the point, we in the health ministry know that we've reached the point where the easy people to identify have been identified. So the ones that are left are either the ones that are hard to reach, or they're the ones who don't have the habit or the desire to test, or they actually don't want to test. And one thing that the statistics show is that young Namibians generally, but particularly young Namibian men between 15 and 29, don't test. And so what we're looking at right now and working with our partners and the government on is, first we have to figure out what are the barriers to testing for young men? Why aren't they doing it? And then try to address those barriers. We're looking at ways already of reaching men where they work. Miners, seafarers, truckers. In a slightly longer term sense, I think what we're going to need to do is try to make HIV testing part of regular health care here, so that when young people, particularly after they become sexually active, when young people go to the doctor once a year to get a checkup, an HIV test is just a standard part of it. But the other reason that I raised this last week at the press conference is that I wanted to ask people like you why it is you think that your peers don't test, because that's one of the things we're going to be doing, I think, intensively in the next few weeks, a few months, is talking to young Namibians about what it is that would make it easier for them to test or make it more likely for them to test.
Now, as you approach young people, as you said, over the course of the next few weeks, is it going to be all over the country or just certain parts?
No, it's definitely all over the country, although you should be aware that PEPFAR is supplementing what the Ministry of Health and Social Services is doing here. And as a result, we tend to seek to fill in the gaps or to kind of top up what the government is able to do in given regions. And what that has meant for us in the last few years is we've increasingly focused our activities in certain regions where the HIV prevalence rate is the highest. So that's where most of our work is being done. But the Ministry of Health is also working all over the country. And so we're doing this all over the country. I mean, I was in Rundu last week and had an opportunity to talk to an HIV positive teen group that's a support group for HIV positive teens. And we talked to them at some length about why do they think young men and boys don't want to test, and getting their ideas about how to encourage it to happen more often.
So regarding the cooperation, as you said now, with the Land Ministry, which is the Ministry of Health, how would you describe that relationship, that cooperation?
We have an incredibly close relationship with the Ministry of Health. We implement our PEPFAR programming here primarily through two U.S. government agencies, the U.S. Agency for International Development, or people know it as USAID, and the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC. And CDC's offices are actually at the Ministry of Health here in Windhoek. So if they have a question, they have an issue to discuss, they literally just walk down the hall and they talk to their counterparts.
At the beginning of this year, in March to be specific, the current president of the United States, Donald Trump, pledged that he was going to cut America's funding to foreign countries. How would this affect PEPFAR?
Well, by sheer coincidence, the president's proposed budget was announced in detail yesterday, and it includes $5 billion for PEPFAR for our fiscal year 2018, which starts on October 1st. Our financial year is 6 months off of the Namibian one. And so what that means is that the money that they've proposed to Congress be devoted to PEPFAR, we won't actually see until October of 2019. That's one of the things I tried to explain last week, is that because of the way we do budgeting, we already know what our PEPFAR budget starting October 1st is. It's for Namibia, it's $72.3 million. But if you look at the president's new budget, the one that will take effect for PEPFAR the following year, there is a focus on 12 high-burden countries and on making sure that those countries reach the 90-90-90 goals by 2020, and Namibia is one of those countries. So I think that the president's new budget is pretty clear in its continuing the work we've done with PEPFAR and keeping the focus maintained on the countries where the burden is highest.
Speaking of PEPFAR budget, I saw that last week, or rather last year, about 700 million was spent. This year around, this time around this year, about $1 billion is Namibian dollars is budgeted for this year.
That's right.
Why the increase?
Because in 2012, 2013, the PEPFAR spending, to give a little history, the PEPFAR spending in Namibia peaked in 2011. And after that, because of the progress that was being made, because of the reductions in mother-to-child transmission, because of the reduction in new cases, because of the reduction in deaths from AIDS, we began tapering off in our projected budgets in the out years what we were going to be spending here, because we didn't think we'd need to spend it. And then a demographic health survey was done in the country in 2013. The results became available in 2014. And what it showed was that there were pockets, parts of the country, where the prevalence rate was a lot higher than anybody realized. And at that point, we realized that we needed to redirect our resources and our efforts at those targets to keep them from being, in effect, a new source of infection. So our budget actually started picking up again. And the budget for this year that we're in right now was an increase over the previous year. And it's a reflection of the fact that we've tried to accelerate care, identification, care, and treatment. And for next year, it's actually going up a little bit more because we're adding some new kinds of programming that we haven't done before here. Programming that's been done in places like Kenya and Uganda that's aimed specifically at adolescent girls and young women and empowering them so that they can stay AIDS-free, because they are probably the most vulnerable part of the population in that respect.
The HIV infection rate in children born to HIV positive mothers has decreased, is it? Dropped by 90%.
That's right.
Would you describe this as the most significant achievement by the program?
It is certainly one of the most significant achievements, and in fact, one of the reasons I was in Rundu last week was I was highlighting the success at the Nyangana Hospital, where they've reduced mother-to-child transmission by almost 95%. And that is something that is absolutely key for the long-term control of the epidemic. But Namibia has done other remarkable things too. I mean, you think, as I said earlier, there are 166,000 people who are identified and know their status, and of those, about 147,000 who are on antiretroviral treatment have suppressed the virus in their bodies, so they're able to lead normal lives and not transmit the disease. That's a remarkable achievement. We last year got 35,000 males in this country to get circumcised to protect them from HIV. This year we're hoping to reach a target of 45,000. That's a pretty remarkable achievement too. I mean, there have been a number of ways in which Namibia has stood out as an example for other high-burden countries in Southern Africa.
Would you say Namibia is leading when it comes to circumcision and so on compared to other countries?
Circumcision, not so much. Namibia has been actually kind of slow to adapt to circumcision, I think for cultural reasons. But in the last couple of years, we've seen quite a pickup in the number of young men who are volunteering to be circumcised. And I think it's simply because the information has gotten to them that it reduces their chance of getting HIV by 60%. There are other areas, though. Mother-to-child transmission is one particularly where Namibia's performance really exceeds almost anybody else.
Yeah. Are there any other programs besides circumcision and mother-to-child transmission?
Oh yeah, there are a lot. I mean, we do, for example, programs for orphans and vulnerable children. And even though this isn't a medical treatment thing, just in the last 6 months, we've gotten 58,000 vulnerable children registered with the Ministry of Gender and Child Welfare so that they can have access to grants from the government to support them. That's the kind of thing that they need to have in order to, for example, stay in school. And if they stay in school, then they're going to learn about safe sexual reproductive health, and they'll be able to avoid getting HIV later in life. I mean, we have tested, as I said, the government and we together and our other partners have tested more than 300,000 people in the last year. And that number, we hope, is going to be even higher this year, which is another remarkable accomplishment when you think about the fact that this country has 2.3 million people. We are just launching with the government a countrywide health assessment, a population-based health assessment that will end up testing more than 1% of the entire country. So 1 out of 100 of every Namibian will be tested as a result of this. And at that point, when it's finished by the end of the year, we should have an idea down to the health district level of what the prevalence and incidence and other rates that are relevant to fighting AIDS are. And that's, in a way, I mean, I'm throwing out a lot of numbers. But what I've had to learn all these numbers, because what I've learned in the process of following this subject for the last 2.5 years is that it's all about data. It's all about knowing what you're accomplishing and what you're not accomplishing, and then addressing the things that aren't getting done. And the only way to do that is to stay constantly on top of who's getting tested, who's getting treatment, who's positive, who's on medication, all of that, countrywide. And it's a big job.
Talk to us about Peace Corps volunteers here. Are there any that are currently assisting in our health sector?
There are indeed. The Peace Corps program here celebrated 25 years in Namibia about 1.5 years ago, so it's almost as old as the country itself. The country program is quite robust still. We have at any given time between 150 and 160 volunteers in the country. They are engaged in 3 sectors, education, healthcare, and what they call community economic development. About half of them do education, they're teachers, and then the other half are split between health and CED. Give you an example of some of what I've seen in the field. I was outside Katima Molilo a couple of months ago at a little place called Linyanti, and went to visit a school where there's a Peace Corps volunteer teaching English and science at a combined school. And the principal of the school came out to greet me, and he said, "First, we have to go into my office." And I said, "Okay." And we went in, we sat down in his office, and he pulled out a chart. And because the Peace Corps volunteer who's at the school now is the 3rd or 4th that they've had in a row. And he said, "I want to show you what the test scores here, how they've changed in the time we've had a volunteer here." And the test scores have gone way up, particularly in English. But I mean, across the board, they've gone up. So that was an indication to me that the volunteers are making a positive contribution and that it's valued by their community. I have seen health volunteers in places like, well, at the Ononjokwe Hospital, for example. We have, she has just finished her tour here, but she'll be replaced by another one. A health volunteer who was responsible for leading all of the youth camps and the youth clubs and the youth support groups, more than 900 young Namibians that she was organizing different activities for. The basic purpose of which is to teach life skills, to give them a comfortable setting to talk about the issues they face, and for the ones who are HIV positive, to help them deal with things like stigma. And then the community economic development volunteers work in, well, for example, in Rundu, there's one at the COSDEC where they do vocational training. The volunteer and her local partner are focused particularly on small and medium enterprise development. So for all of the people who are going through the various kinds of VOTEC training at the COSDEC, the joiners and the plumbers and the seamstresses, they include an element of business planning, of how to manage your money, how to set up a business, and then they have an entirely separate course just for select small business people who are looking to, in essence, to up their game, to get their businesses where they're able to support themselves and actually make a living. And part of that is that the COSDEC even makes short-term loans to the SME students so that they can get their businesses just bring them up to a successful level with the help of the Peace Corps volunteer. So the volunteers are all over the country doing all sorts of things. The health volunteers, though, like our PEPFAR activities, are concentrated primarily in areas where the HIV prevalence is highest.
Since they're doing a substantial job in the education sector, and they're only currently 160, will we be seeing this number increasing soon?
That actually is the highest it's been throughout the lifetime of the program. There's a kind of natural limit of how many Peace Corps volunteers a country can absorb. This country doesn't have that big a population. And so because it's not just a matter of dropping a teacher into a school. They have to be housed. They've got to have a local sponsor. They have to be worked into the school's teaching hierarchy. And so it actually takes quite a bit of time to set up these sites. And once we have the sites set up, we try to use them again and again because we know that the volunteer is well supported. I think, for my purposes, I think 160 is a good number for a country this size. I mean, it is a large program for a country with a population this size.
That's actually one thing I wanted to know, which is how are they adapting the volunteers, especially in the ones maybe in remote areas and so on.
Well, Peace Corps has been at this for a long time. I mean, it got established in the 1960s, and one of the things they do is when they bring them here, they go through a couple of months of introductory training. Part of that is language training, local language training, and part of it involves going and staying with host families for a while in the area they're going to be assigned to so that they can begin to become familiar with the culture. And so we have volunteers that learn, I think it's 7 different Namibian languages, from Afrikaans all the way to Rukwangali. And everything in between. And so they take these language skills. Granted, you can't get fluent in a couple of months, but they take these language skills and they get dropped into these surroundings with people who generally have worked with volunteers before and know how to help them adapt. And our experience shows pretty generally that they adapt remarkably well. And they really seem to, well, Namibia, let's just say Namibia is a very popular country for Peace Corps volunteers.
Ambassador, let me just ask maybe some last remarks from your side.
I have come to understand very fundamentally in my job here that the PEPFAR, that HIV/AIDS work is the big part of what the U.S. government does in Namibia. And more than half of all the people who work for the U.S. Embassy here are working specifically on PEPFAR activities. In any other circumstance, that might or might not be, a rewarding kind of experience. But here it is because there is so much good news and because things work so well and because we are making progress. Our relationship with the government here, and that it's important to remember it's the government that's in the lead. It's another aspect of kind of the Namibian reality that isn't like a lot of other African countries. We work incredibly closely with the government. We follow their lead. We give them advice when they ask for it and when we think that it would be helpful. And together, it's working. And so when it comes to PEPFAR particularly, I mean, it's something that I'm especially proud of in terms of what my government is doing in this country.
So our government is winning?
Yeah, I think it is, yeah. And I think sometimes it doesn't get enough credit for that.
All right. Ambassador.
Joseph.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
All right. And that is all we have for you tonight. Be sure to share your views on the topic on our social media pages or text them to 555. SMS costs $1 Namibian. Catch me again next week, same time, same place. For Unexclusive, I'm Joseph Sheefeni.